What if one simple morning at a small-town diner could change everything? A struggling single dad walks in with his little girl, just like any ordinary day. But in an unexpected twist, she runs to a stranger's table, looks the woman straight in the eye and calls her mom. Was it just an innocent mistake, or a hidden connection that fate quietly arranged? Before we dive into this heartwarming story of love, second chances, and the little girl who brought two lonely souls together, if you believe in the magic of kindness and stories that touch the heart, don't forget to subscribe and join us for more inspiring tales like this one. Now, let's begin the story of how a little girl's question at a diner turned strangers into family. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint aroma of bacon sizzling on the griddle as Elias Carter pushed open the door to Whitman's diner. The small bell above jingled in its familiar, comforting way. Sunlight streamed through the wide windows, casting a warm glow over the checkered floor and faded leather booths. "Morning, Gus," Elias greeted, nodding to the elderly man wiping down the counter. Gus Whitman glanced up, offering his usual grin. "Morning, Eli. The usual table?" Elias gave a half-smile and gently squeezed the hand of his daughter, Lila, who stood beside him, clutching a sketch pad almost as large as herself. "Yep, booth by the window." Lila didn't say a word but gave Gus a shy wave before hurrying to the corner booth. It was their booth, the one with the worn wooden tabletop right beneath a window that overlooked the sleepy main street. For Elias, this booth was more than routine. It was a sanctuary carved out between shifts and life's daily grind. He slid into the seat across from his daughter, watching as she immediately opened her sketch pad and began doodling. Always the same: swirls, little stick figures, and more. Recently, faces with big, kind eyes. "Want the pancakes today or scrambled eggs, sweet pea?" he asked. Lila barely looked up. "Pancakes and apple juice." Elias chuckled softly, signaling Gus without needing to say a word. Gus knew their order by heart after all these years. The diner felt timeless. There was something about the hum of quiet conversations, the clink of utensils, and the occasional creak of the front door that grounded Elias. Out there, life felt like a series of uphill climbs, bills, 2 jobs, the lingering ache of losses he rarely spoke about, but in here there was rhythm, something dependable, and Lila. He glanced at her. She had his unruly dark hair, but her eyes, those wide, curious hazel eyes, were something else entirely. She had arrived in his life when the world felt like it was folding in on itself, a tiny, fragile being abandoned at the doorstep of a church, and somehow, by some twist of fate, she ended up in his arms. "Daddy," Lila said suddenly, tapping her pencil against the table. "What did Mommy look like?" Elias froze. It wasn't the first time she'd asked, but each time it hit him like a blow to the chest. How did you explain to a 6-year-old that you never knew her biological mother? That all the answers she wanted were hidden in shadows? He cleared his throat, forcing a smile. "She had a beautiful heart, kiddo. That's what I like to think." Lila tilted her head thoughtfully, then turned back to her sketch pad. Her pencil moved faster now, more deliberate. Gus arrived with their plates, setting them down gently. "One day," he said, lowering his voice as he caught Elias's eye, "she's gonna surprise you." Elias nodded silently, not trusting himself to speak. As they ate, the door jingled again, and a tall woman entered. She moved with quiet grace, her tailored coat neatly buttoned, sunglasses perched carefully atop her head. Elias didn't pay her much attention at first, but something about the way she glanced around the room, like she didn't quite belong, yet was searching for something, caught his eye. She slid into the corner booth, furthest from everyone else. Alone, Lila peeked up from her drawing and watched the woman for a moment, curious. "Daddy," she whispered, "that lady looks like she's sad." Elias followed her gaze but said nothing. The woman ordered coffee, her voice low, almost guarded. There was a stillness about her, an air of someone carrying too much weight in a world that had no idea. Elias recognized that look. He saw it in the mirror some mornings. Minutes passed. The diner returned to its gentle rhythm. Suddenly, as if pulled by invisible strings, Lila slid out of her seat, sketchpad in hand, and began walking toward the woman's booth. "Lila," Elias called softly, startled. "Where are you going, honey?" But she didn't answer. She walked straight up to the woman clutching her drawing. Elias stood halfway, unsure whether to intervene. The woman looked up as Lila approached, confusion flickering across her face. "Hi," Lila said simply, holding out the sketchpad. "Are you my mommy?" The diner went silent. Elias's heart slammed in his chest. He moved quickly, reaching his daughter's side. "Lila, sweetheart." The woman's expression shifted. Her eyes widened, a sharp breath caught in her throat. She stared at the little girl before her, something unreadable flashing across her face. Elias knelt beside Lila, gently guiding her back. "I'm sorry," he said to the woman, voice tight. She sometimes imagines things." But the woman shook her head slowly, her voice soft and broken. "No, it's quite all right." She looked at Lila one last time, eyes glistening with something Elias couldn't name. The moment lingered, heavy and inexplicably charged, before Elias coaxed Lila back to their booth. She looked down at her drawing, quiet now. The woman paid for her coffee, but didn't leave immediately. She sat for a long while, fingers tracing the rim of her cup, her gaze occasionally drifting toward Elias and Lila. Gus came by, leaning down toward Elias. "Funny thing about kids," he murmured. "They see things we don't." Elias could only nod, unable to shake the strange weight settling over his chest. Outside, the morning sun continued streaming in, but something about the air felt different. Like the quiet gears of fate had just shifted. Vivian Alden sat motionless in the corner booth, long after the man and his daughter returned to their seats. The lukewarm coffee before her remained untouched. Her manicured fingers traced circles on the rim of the cup, but her mind was elsewhere, still, replaying the little girl's question like an echo she couldn't silence. "Are you my mommy?" She had walked into Whitman's diner this morning simply to escape the sterile silence of her penthouse, escape the ceaseless buzz of boardrooms, investment meetings, and her assistant's constant notifications. But what she hadn't expected was the tiny voice of a stranger's child pulling at something raw and buried deep inside her. She took a steadying breath, eyes flickering to the booth by the window where the man, Elias, she overheard Gus call him, was, now murmuring softly to the little girl, brushing her curls back tenderly. There was something about the two of them that felt untouched by the cynicism of the world Vivienne had spent decades navigating. Something simple, something she hadn't felt in years. Vivian reached instinctively for her purse, pulling out her sunglasses, though there was no sun in the diner. A reflex. Shields up. Always. Before she could rise, Gus approached quietly, setting a fresh pot of coffee on her table. "Everything all right, Miss?" he asked gently, eyes kind but perceptive. She forced a faint smile, the kind she'd perfected. "In corporate galas and fundraising events. Yes, thank you. Just caught off guard." Gus nodded, wiping his hands on his apron. "Kids have a way of doing that, especially ones like Lila." Vivienne glanced once more at the little girl. "Lila," he'd said. "Such an old-fashioned, sweet name." The child was now back to her sketchpad, her small brow furrowed in concentration, as if the strange encounter moments ago hadn't happened at all. "Is she—" Vivian hesitated, realizing how intrusive her question might sound. "Is she his biological daughter?" Gus gave a knowing shrug. "Eli doesn't talk much about it. Good man, works hard, raises that little girl like she's his own blood." Something in Gus's voice softened. She's had a tough start, that one, but she's got a light in her, lights up the whole diner some days. Vivian swallowed the lump forming in her throat. She shouldn't care. She shouldn't ask more. But against her better judgment, her curiosity tugged at her. "How old is she?" she asked quietly. 6, Gus replied. Then added, "Funny, she's been drawing mothers in her sketchbook lately. Eli never says much, but, well, sometimes kids sense the gaps before anyone else does." Vivian nodded politely, her throat suddenly tight. She rose, leaving a bill on the table, more than enough to cover the coffee. She gathered her coat, casting one last glance at the little girl who had so casually called her Mom. Outside, the cool air hit her face, sharp and refreshing. She stood for a moment on the sidewalk, letting the morning sounds of the small town swirl around her. Cars humming by, a distant dog barking, the rustle of leaves underfoot. Vivian Alden wasn't used to being unsettled. Her life was measured, controlled, calculated down to every minute. She had built walls so high around herself that not even scandal nor heartbreak could shake them. And yet, one question from a stranger's child had splintered something fragile inside her. Inside the diner, Elias watched the woman leave. There was something unmistakably elegant about her, the precise way she carried herself, the guarded expression she wore like armor. He sighed, returning his focus to Lila, who had finished her pancakes and was now adding bold strokes to her. "Latest sketch, sweetheart," he said gently. "Why did you ask that lady if she was your mom?" Lila didn't look up. "She looked like the lady in my dreams," she murmured, as if it were the simplest explanation in the world. Elias felt a pang of something sharp. "Dreams?" Lila nodded, finally glancing at him. "Sometimes I dream about a lady. She has the same eyes. She's always smiling at me." Elias swallowed, unsure how to respond. He knew Lila was old enough to start asking questions, and every time she did, it felt like a slow unraveling inside him. "She was just a nice lady having coffee," he said quietly, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "You already have me, remember?" Lila smiled faintly, but Elias could see she wasn't fully convinced. He stared at her drawing. The lady she sketched bore a striking resemblance to the woman who'd just walked out. Coincidence, he told himself. Kids latch onto images, faces. It didn't mean anything, but the heaviness lingered. Vivian drove through the winding streets back, toward the edge of town, her mind distant, hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. She wasn't one to believe in signs or fate. Her world was numbers, decisions, strategy, but today felt different. The little girl's eyes haunted her. That question, asked so innocently, had stirred something she hadn't dared touch in decades. Vivian's foot hovered over the brake as she neared the turnoff to her estate. Instead, she kept driving past the gates, past the manicured lawns, continuing until she reached the overlook that gave a sweeping view of the valley below. She parked, cutting the engine, and stared out at the horizon, the sun climbing higher. Her phone buzzed relentlessly in her purse. Emails, calendar reminders, assistants needing her input. She ignored it all. For the first time in years, she wondered if the life she'd built, brick by brick, might be missing something essential, and, for reasons she couldn't quite name yet, she knew she'd find herself back at that diner again soon. The next morning unfolded like every other, sunlight peeking through thin curtains, the distant hum of delivery trucks rolling past the apartment complex, the familiar clatter of Elias Carter preparing Lila's breakfast, routine, steady, safe. But, for the first time in months, Elias felt the undercurrent of something unsettled. He watched Lila at the kitchen table, swinging her legs rhythmically beneath her chair, her fingers gripping a crayon as she worked on yet another drawing. Always faces. Always women with kind, open eyes. Yesterday's moment at Whitman's diner lingered in the corners of his mind like a shadow he couldn't shake. Lila had asked strangers questions before. Children her age were naturally curious. But there was something about the way she'd approached that woman, direct, certain, as if some deeper instinct had nudged her forward. Elias ran a hand over his face, trying to shake the gnawing tightness in his chest. He couldn't afford distractions, not when bills loomed, shifts waited, and raising Lila required all his focus. He crouched beside her, gently touching her shoulder. "Ready for the diner, kiddo?" Lila beamed, hopping off the chair, clutching her sketchpad close like it contained secret worlds only she could unlock. Whitman's diner buzzed with its usual quiet energy when they arrived. The bell chimed overhead and Gus greeted them with his easy smile. "Mornin', Eli, Lila." Gus nodded, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "Morning, Gus," Elias returned, guiding Lila to their usual booth. She climbed in immediately, flipping open her sketchpad as though yesterday had never happened. But Gus leaned over slightly, lowering his voice as Elias passed him at the counter. "She's not here today," he murmured, a twinkle in his eye. Elias frowned slightly. "Who?" "The lady from yesterday," Gus clarified, as if reading his thoughts. "Thought maybe you were wondering." Elias gave a brief shake of his head, lips twitching into something close to a smile. "Just curious, I guess." But truthfully, curiosity wasn't the right word. It was something deeper, something like unease. He settled across from Lila, sipping the coffee Gus had already poured. The diner felt as familiar as always. Murmured conversations, the faint strains of classic rock playing from the jukebox, the occasional clang from the kitchen, but Elias couldn't help glancing at the empty corner booth. A strange hollowness settled in his chest. Several blocks away, Vivian Alden stood in front of the mirror, buttoning the last clasp on her tailored jacket. She adjusted the lapel, regarding her reflection carefully. Polished, controlled, impeccable. Yet no amount of designer fabric could quiet the restless energy in her chest. She should be at a board meeting. She should be reviewing investment reports or coordinating with her legal team. That's where she belonged, inside the sharp, defined lines of power and precision. Instead, her thoughts drifted back to a little girl's wide, expectant eyes. Vivian exhaled slowly and grabbed her keys. Against her better judgment, she was heading back to Whitman's diner. When she pushed open the door, the familiar chime rang out, and the scent of bacon and coffee enveloped her immediately. Gus glanced up from behind the counter, recognition flickering in his eyes. Without a word, he gestured toward the corner booth she'd occupied yesterday. Vivienne nodded, sliding into the seat, but her eyes didn't rest on the menu. They drifted to the booth by the window, the one with the man and the little girl. Lila spotted her almost instantly, her face lighting up. She tugged at Elias's sleeve urgently. "Daddy, she's back!" Elias's shoulders stiffened slightly before he turned to see Vivienne sitting there poised, yet seemingly uncertain. He glanced down at Lila, who was already slipping from her seat. "Lila, wait," he began, but it was too late. She approached Vivienne's table, sketchpad clutched to her chest. "Hi," Lila said shyly, standing beside the booth. Vivienne looked up, something softening in her expression. "Well, hello again." Lila glanced over her shoulder at her father, then leaned closer. "Can I show you something?" Vivienne nodded, and Lila opened her sketchpad, flipping to the latest page. It was a drawing, not messy like typical children's doodles, but surprisingly deliberate. A woman's face. Large eyes, gentle smile, dark hair cascading down. Vivienne stared at it, her throat tightening inexplicably. "That's you," Lila said simply. Vivienne blinked, unable to summon a reply. For years, she'd been painted in newspapers, featured, in magazines, sketched by corporate caricaturists, but never had she seen herself rendered so innocently, so earnestly. "Why did you draw me?" Vivian asked, her voice quieter than usual. Leela shrugged as if the answer was obvious. "You look like someone who belongs." Vivian's breath caught. Of all the boardrooms, galas, estates she'd moved through in her life, she wasn't sure she'd ever heard words so disarming. Before she could respond, Elias approached, his smile apologetic, but tinged with something unreadable. "I hope she's not bothering you," he said, gently taking Leela's hand. "Not at all," Vivian answered quickly, surprising herself with how much she meant it. There was an awkward pause, an unspoken something hanging between them. Gus called out from behind the counter, breaking the tension. "Coffee, Miss?" Vivian nodded. "Yes, please, and maybe a slice of that pie today." Elias glanced at her curiously, then back at Lila, who was already tugging him toward their booth. As he sat down, Elias caught Vivian's eye briefly. She offered the faintest smile, and just like that, the weight pressing on Elias's chest felt a little lighter. Across town, the world continued spinning, the stock market's deadlines daily grind, but inside the modest walls of Whitman's diner, something invisible had shifted. A delicate thread had formed, barely visible, quietly weaving its way between three unlikely souls. And none of them yet understood how tightly it would bind them. Vivian Alden stood at the grand window of her penthouse, the city skyline stretched before her like an intricate painting. Twinkling lights danced across glass towers, but her eyes were distant, unfocused, tracing invisible lines beyond the horizon. Her fingers gripped the edge of her whiskey tumbler, though she hadn't touched the drink. The echo of a little girl's voice still lingered in her ears. "You look like someone who belongs." It had been years since anyone, let alone a child, had spoken to her without pretense, without calculation. The words had cut past the walls she'd spent decades constructing. With a sigh, Vivian walked away from the window, setting the glass down untouched. She crossed the sleek living room, the silence pressing in on her. The polished floors, the expensive furniture, the immaculate perfection, it all felt sterile tonight. On the mahogany bookshelf near her desk sat an old leather-bound photo album, mostly forgotten. Her hand hovered over it, hesitant, before pulling it free. She carried it to the couch, sat down, and flipped open the worn cover. The first photo stared back at her. A younger version of herself, no more than 18, smiling stiffly beside. Her parents at a summer estate. Her mother's sharp eyes, her father's formal stance. Even in still images, the weight of expectation seemed palpable. She turned the page slowly. There, nestled among neatly arranged snapshots, was a picture she rarely allowed herself to look at. A hospital room. A bundled infant swaddled in soft, pink. Vivian herself, barely recognizable, exhausted, tear-streaked, but holding the baby like she was the most precious thing in the universe. Her daughter, unplanned, unwanted by her family. Quickly erased from public view, Vivian swallowed hard, fingers brushing over the photo. She had named her Hannah, but that name, like everything else about her baby, had been lost when her parents arranged the adoption before she'd even left. The hospital. She never knew what became of her. Until yesterday, that chapter had stayed tightly locked away, boxed up in favor of the life she'd built. Successful, polished, controlled. But now the little girl at the diner, Lila, had stirred, something she thought long dead. Those wide hazel eyes, that inexplicable sense of familiarity. It was foolish, she told herself, coincidence. But no matter how she tried, she couldn't quiet the gnawing inside her chest. Her phone vibrated sharply against the coffee table, pulling. Her back. She glanced at the screen. Margot Lee. Vivian hesitated, then answered. "Viv?" Margot's voice came warm, unhurried. "I've been trying to get a hold of you all day. Everything all right?" Vivian exhaled slowly. "I'm fine, just distracted." "That's not like you." Margot paused, then added gently, "Talk to me." Vivian's lips pressed tightly. Margot had been her closest friend for decades, the one person who had known her before she became the formidable Vivian Alden, CEO, the one who had held her hand in that hospital room all those years ago. "I ran into someone yesterday," Vivian said, choosing her words carefully. "A little girl." She heard Margot's breath catch slightly. "She asked if I was her mother," Vivian continued quietly. "Out of nowhere. Just walked up to me, like she knew me." Silence stretched across the line. "Do you think she might be—" Margot hesitated. Vivienne shook her head reflexively, even though Margot couldn't see her. "It's impossible. She's too young. Just a coincidence." Margot's voice softened. "Viv, I know how much you've tried to move past it, but maybe it's not just coincidence. Maybe you were meant to cross paths." Vivian rubbed her temples, the ache growing behind her eyes. "You know I don't believe in that fate nonsense." Margot gave a small chuckle. "Well, maybe it believes in you." They lapsed into silence for a moment before Margot's voice lowered. "Go back. See her again. It won't hurt to know more." Vivian didn't respond. She simply stared down at the photo of herself holding baby Hannah, the lines of the past blurring with the present. Across town, Elias sat on the edge of his worn couch, a stack of unopened bills on the coffee table. Lila was fast asleep in the next room, the faint sound of her steady breathing drifting down the hallway. He should have been focused on his finances, planning which payment to prioritize next, but his mind kept circling back to the woman at the diner. Vivienne Alden. There was something about her, a quiet sadness beneath the polished exterior, a look he recognized because he saw it sometimes in his own reflection. He leaned back, letting out a long breath. He didn't know why Lila had fixated on her. He didn't know why seeing Vivian unsettled something inside him. What he did know was that his daughter deserved answers, about where she came from, about the family she never knew. Tomorrow, he decided, he'd ask Gus if he knew more about the woman, just enough to ease this restless feeling gnawing at him. The next morning, Vivian found herself back in front of Whitman's diner, parked across the street. She hadn't meant to stop. She had told herself she was just taking a drive, clearing her head. But here she was. The diner's neon sign flickered lazily, the soft hum of life inside barely visible through the window. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. Margot's words echoed in her mind. "Maybe you were meant to cross paths." Vivienne didn't know what she was looking for, but as she watched, Elias and Lila through the glass, something unspoken tugged at her again. She gathered her breath, opened the door, and stepped inside. The old bell chimed as Vivian stepped through the door of Whitman's diner for the third time in as many days. This time, she entered with purpose, but also a quiet hesitancy that she couldn't quite shake. The morning crowd was light, just a few regulars nursing cups of coffee, the hum of conversation low. Behind the counter, Gus glanced up, recognition flashing in his eyes, though he masked it quickly behind his usual easy smile. "Morning, Miss," he greeted, wiping his hands on his apron. "Your booth's open." Vivienne nodded politely, sliding into her familiar corner, but her eyes didn't stay on the menu. Instead, they instinctively drifted toward the booth by the window. There they were, Elias and Lila. Elias sat with the same quiet focus, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly while Lila doodled away in her sketchpad. There was a rhythm between them, something almost sacred in its simplicity. No pretense, no carefully curated image, just the soft murmur of conversation and the occasional laugh when Lila showed him a particularly whimsical drawing. Vivian found herself watching them longer than she intended. Her gaze shifted to Gus, who approached her booth with a fresh pot of coffee. "Same as usual?" he asked, his tone gentle. She nodded, then hesitated. "Gus, that man, Elias, he's a regular here?" Gus glanced over his shoulder, following her gaze. "Eli? Yeah, been coming here with Lila for years." Good man, works hard, keeps to himself mostly. Vivian toyed with the edge of her napkin. She's his daughter? Gus's eyes softened. Not by blood. Adopted her when she was just a baby. Story goes, her birth parents couldn't care for her, and Eli stepped up, never once treated her as anything but his own. Vivian's throat tightened. He's raising her alone? Gus gave a slow nod. Lost his wife young. Never. Remarried, but he's got a heart bigger than most folks I've met. Vivian absorbed the words in silence, something warm and unfamiliar stirring beneath the surface. Before she could respond, the front door banged open, followed by the unmistakable sound of a sputtering engine outside. Heads turned as a man, mid-50s, grease stains on his shirt, frustration written all over his face, stepped inside, rubbing his hands together. "Anyone know a good mechanic?" The man called out to no one in particular. "My truck's dead out there and I need to make deliveries. Before noon." Gus glanced around, then gestured toward Elias's booth. "Eli's your guy." Elias looked up, modestly waving a hand. "I can take a look." He stood, quietly excusing himself to Lila, who barely glanced up from her sketchpad. As Elias passed Vivian's booth, their eyes met briefly, a simple acknowledgement, but something electric passed between them. Outside, the man led Elias to the hood of his pickup. Vivian watched as Elias rolled up his sleeves, crouched over the engine, and worked with calm efficiency, wiping sweat from his brow, but never complaining. There was something inherently selfless about it. How he offered help without hesitation, without expectation. After several minutes, the engine roared back to life. The man clapped Elias on the shoulder, thanking him profusely before driving off. Elias wiped his hands and re-entered the diner, moving past Vivian without fanfare. But as he passed, she found herself speaking without thinking. "That was kind. Of you." He paused, turning toward her table, surprise flickering in his eyes. "Wasn't much," Elias replied, brushing his hands on a rag. "Figure if you can help, you should." Vivian nodded slowly, then, almost against her usual instincts, gestured to the seat across from her. "Care to join me?" Elias hesitated, glancing toward Lila. She was still lost in her drawings. Content. After a brief pause, he slid into the seat, his posture slightly guarded but not unfriendly. "Ms." he prompted. "Vivian," she supplied. "Vivian Alden." "Elias Carter," he said simply, offering his hand across the table. His grip was strong, steady. For a moment, neither spoke. The hum of the diner carried on around them, but inside the booth, there was an almost tangible quiet. "Your daughter," Vivian began cautiously. "She seems special." Elias's lips quirked faintly. "She is." Vivian hesitated. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but she said something to me the other day about belonging." Elias's gaze softened, though his eyes clouded slightly. "She's got a vivid imagination," he said carefully. "Always has." Vivian nodded, though her curiosity remained piqued. There was something about him, something resolute, yet weighted, by years of shouldering more than one man should bear alone. She recognized it because in some ways she wore the same armor. "I envy that," Vivian admitted quietly. Elias raised an eyebrow. "Her imagination." "No," she said softly. "Her ability to see people without walls." For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then Elias offered a small, genuine smile. "Walls keep things out, but sometimes they keep things from getting in too." Vivian's chest tightened unexpectedly at his words. Before she could reply, Gus appeared with a fresh pot of coffee, refilling their cups like he'd been waiting for this moment. Lila, sensing the shift in the room, wandered over to their booth. Clutching her sketchpad, Vivian glanced down as Lila proudly flipped to a new drawing, a picture of the diner, their little booth, and all three of them seated together. Her heart skipped, Elias looked at his daughter, then at Vivian, and in that small, ordinary moment, surrounded by coffee cups and pancake plates, something shifted quietly, permanently. They didn't know it yet, but the first bricks of their walls had just crumbled. Elias Carter stood at the sink that evening, sleeves rolled up, hands submerged in soapy water. Outside, the sky had turned dusky, streaked with the faint orange of a setting sun. The apartment was quiet, except for the clatter of dishes and the occasional sound of Lila humming softly as she colored in the living room. But despite the familiar rhythms of the evening, Elias couldn't shake the weight in his chest. It had been 3 days since Vivian Alden had sat across from him at Whitman's diner, her presence both calming and unsettling in equal measure. There was something about her, a poised elegance masking something deeper, something quietly broken that mirrored parts of himself. And then there was Lila. That day she'd approached Vivian with her innocent question. It had seemed like nothing more than a child's whim, but the way Lila had connected with her, the way Vivian's guarded expression had softened, it lingered in Elias's mind, gnawing at his thoughts. He dried his hands, glancing toward the stack of mail on the kitchen counter. Among the bills and advertisements, one envelope caught his eye, a faded letter, the handwriting on the front unfamiliar. Curious, he opened it and unfolded a brief note. It was from Gus. Eli, got a friend who might be able to help with some answers about Lila's past. Drop by the diner tomorrow, Gus. Elias frowned slightly, rereading the note. He'd never asked Gus outright about digging into Lila's origins. Adoption had always felt like a fresh start, a line drawn between what came before and what mattered now, but something had shifted. Perhaps it was Vivian's presence, or perhaps it was the look in Lila's eyes when she asked questions he couldn't answer. Either way, the pull was undeniable. The next morning, Elias arrived at Whitman's earlier than usual. Lila trailed. Beside him, clutching her sketchpad, though today she seemed quieter, more contemplative. Inside, the diner buzzed with its usual hum. Gus stood behind the counter, polishing mugs, but when he spotted Elias, he nodded toward the back corner. "Got someone I want you to meet," Gus murmured as Elias approached. At the corner table sat a tall man, broad-shouldered, wearing a plain, button-down shirt and a well-worn leather jacket. He stood as Elias neared, extending a hand. "Detective Harris," the man introduced himself, voice calm, steady. "Retired now, but Gus tells me you might need some assistance." Elias shook, his hand firmly, feeling the rough calluses beneath his grip. "Elias Carter," he replied. "Not sure if there's much to find, but I've got some questions." Harris gestured for him to sit. "Let's talk." Lila settled in a booth nearby, her sketchpad open, but her eyes occasionally glancing toward them. Elias explained how he'd adopted Lila as an infant through the county, how little information he'd ever been given about her birth parents. The adoption had been clean, official, but beyond the basic records, there had always been gaps. "Didn't seem to matter much at first," Elias admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "She's my daughter, plain and simple, but lately—" His voice trailed off. Harris nodded knowingly. "Kids start asking questions, want to know where they came from." Elias met his gaze. "And sometimes I wonder if it's something I owe her, knowing." Harris leaned back thoughtfully. "State records can be a maze, but I still have a few connections. Might be able to trace the file, see if there's any unsealed information, maybe a birth certificate, medical records, family names." Elias hesitated. "You think there's a chance?" The detective shrugged. "Never hurts to try." Gus brought over coffee, setting it down quietly, letting them continue without interruption. Before they parted, Harris pulled out a small notepad, scribbling down details Elias provided. Lila's birth date, the year the adoption finalized, the agency's name. "I'll see what I can dig up," Harris promised, tucking the notebook away. As Elias thanked him, he caught sight of Vivian entering the diner. She paused briefly at the door, eyes scanning until they landed on him. Their gazes met, something unspoken passing between them. She made her way to her usual corner booth, but today she looked less guarded, more present. Later that afternoon, after Harris had gone, Elias found himself standing outside Vivian's booth, Lila already at his side, fidgeting with her sketchpad. "Mind if we join you?" Elias asked, voice tentative but sincere. Vivian looked up, startled but not displeased. "Please," she said softly, gesturing to the seat opposite. They slid in, Lila immediately flipping to her newest drawing, a depiction of the diner, Gus. Behind the counter, Elias and Vivian seated at a table, a heart hovering above them. Vivian laughed lightly, a sound Elias hadn't heard from her before. "She's got quite the imagination," she remarked, meeting his eyes. Elias nodded, then hesitated. "Lila's been asking questions lately about family." Vivian's smile faded slightly, her posture straightening. "That's natural." "I've never known much about where she came from," Elias admitted, his voice quieter now. "But someone's helping me look into it. Detective Harris." Vivian's expression shifted, curiosity mingling with something deeper. She opened her mouth, then closed it as if weighing whether to speak. Finally she asked carefully, "Do you ever wonder if the people she came from are still out there?" Elias looked at her, his jaw tightening slightly. "I do," he said honestly, "but I also wonder if knowing would help, or just hurt." Vivian's eyes softened, something flickering there. "Sometimes," she murmured almost to herself, "knowing is the only way to heal." The words hung between them, fragile but heavy. Elias glanced at Lila, who was now adding finishing touches to her drawing. 3 figures side by side, beneath the diner's neon sign. For a moment, the simple scene felt impossibly significant, and, though neither of them said it aloud, both Elias and Vivian sensed it. The missing pieces of their lives were slowly falling into place. The skies over Millbrook had darkened by late afternoon, heavy clouds rolling in like silent witnesses to a story that had yet to unfold. The scent of rain lingered in the air, thick and expectant, as Elias Carter pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders. Whitman's diner glowed softly through the gathering gloom, a beacon of familiarity against the encroaching storm. Elias and Lila stepped inside, just as the first raindrops began to patter against the pavement. Inside, the diner was quieter than usual. Gus stood behind the counter, watching the storm gather through the front window, his brow furrowed slightly. The other regulars had filtered out early, perhaps sensing the weather's shift. "Afternoon, Eli. Storm's coming fast," Gus greeted, nodding toward the window. Elias nodded in return, guiding Lila to their booth. "Figured we'd wait it." "Out here?" Lila settled into her seat without a word, pulling her sketchpad close. Her usual chatter was muted, eyes darting to the darkening sky outside. As Gus poured Elias a coffee, the diner door opened again, the bell chiming faintly. Vivian Alden stepped in, her hair damp from the rain, coat drawn tightly around her. She hesitated briefly at the entrance before spotting them. Their eyes met. Without needing invitation, she made her way to their booth. "Looks like we had the same idea," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough warmth to soften the edges. Elias offered a small smile. "Good place to be during a storm." Vivian slid into the seat across from them, glancing at Lila, who returned to her sketching but occasionally peeked at Vivian from under her lashes. Gus appeared with another cup of coffee for Vivian, setting it down wordlessly. She murmured her thanks, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. Outside, the rain began to come down harder, sheets of water blurring the view beyond the windows. Thunder rumbled distantly. The 3 of them sat in companionable silence, the only sounds the hum of the diner's jukebox and the steady tap of rain against glass. But beneath the quiet, something hung in the air, unsaid, waiting. It was Vivienne who broke it first. "My parents used to send me away during storms," she said abruptly, her gaze focused somewhere beyond the window. "Boarding schools, summer homes, anywhere but home." Elias glanced at her, surprised by the sudden vulnerability in her tone. She gave a faint smile, self-deprecating. "They thought storms were distractions, inconveniences to be avoided." Lila looked up briefly, eyes wide. "I like storms," she said simply. "They make everything quiet." Vivienne turned to her, genuinely touched by the innocence in the statement. "Maybe that's why I ended up here today," Vivienne murmured, mostly to herself. "Quiet is something I don't have much of." Elias studied her carefully. There was something in her posture, a weariness he recognized too well. He understood walls. He understood what it took to keep them standing, and maybe tonight the storm was tearing a few down. "You ever wish," Elias asked slowly, voice low, "that you'd had the chance to start over? Rewrite things?" Vivienne's eyes flickered. She nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "I used to," she said quietly, "but after a while you stop believing in second chances." Lila suddenly slid from her seat, climbing up beside Vivienne without hesitation. She leaned her small head against Vivienne's arm. "Daddy says everyone gets second chances," Lila announced solemnly, as if this were absolute truth. Vivienne froze, glancing down at the little girl leaning trustingly against her. For a moment, her mask cracked and something fragile glimmered beneath. She placed a tentative hand on Lila's back, her throat tightening. Elias watched them, something shifting deep in his chest. The storm outside roared louder, wind howling against the windows, but inside the diner, the three of them remained wrapped in a cocoon of unexpected calm. After a long pause, Vivienne spoke again, her voice softer now. "There was a time," she admitted, her eyes never leaving Lila, "when I made a choice. Or rather, the choice was made for me. I lost someone important, someone I never stopped wondering about." She swallowed hard, her fingers brushing lightly against Lila's curls. "I thought," Vivienne continued, her voice breaking just slightly, "that building walls, achieving things, would fill that emptiness. But it doesn't." Elias's jaw clenched gently, understanding radiating behind his quiet gaze. Lila yawned beside Vivienne, resting her head more fully against her. The woman's arm instinctively tightened around the child's small frame. The storm showed no signs of letting up. Elias leaned forward, voice low but certain. "Sometimes," he said, "the things we lose have a way of finding us again. Just in unexpected places." Vivienne met his gaze, something unreadable flickering in her eyes. Maybe it was the storm, maybe it was the quiet, maybe it was the feel of Lila's tiny heartbeat against her side. Whatever it was, Vivienne felt something shift within her, a loosening, a softening, as if the walls she had built so carefully had finally begun to give way. For the first time in years, she wasn't sure if that frightened her or freed her. Thunder rumbled once more, but inside Whitman's diner, there was only stillness. And in that stillness, something unspoken yet profound passed between them. Three hearts, each carrying their own secrets, slowly beginning to recognize themselves reflected in one another. The morning after the storm smelled like renewal, rain-washed sidewalks, crisp air, and streets shimmering under thin layers of sunlight. But for Elias Carter, there was something taut beneath the calm, something waiting to surface. He stood at the sink, staring out the kitchen window as Lila hummed softly in the living room, content with her drawings. The previous night replayed in his mind on a loop. Vivienne's quiet confession, the way she'd held Lila close, as if afraid to let go. And then there was Detective Harris. As if summoned by thought, Elias's phone buzzed against the counter. He dried his hands hastily and answered, "Eli, it's Harris." Elias's heart rate quickened slightly. "Any news?" A pause on the other end, then the detective's voice leveled out. "I ran those records through my contacts. Wasn't easy. Some files were sealed tight, but I found something." Elias braced himself. "There's a note in Lila's birth file," Harris continued. "Her biological mother's name is Hannah Alden." Elias felt like the floor dropped beneath him. "Alden?" he repeated, stunned. "Yeah," Harris confirmed. "I figured the name might ring a bell. Hannah passed away shortly after giving birth. Complications. No record of the father. The family name, Alden. It's not common. Might be worth asking around." Elias's thoughts scrambled to connect the dots. Vivian Alden, the woman who kept showing up at the diner, the guarded sadness in her eyes. Lila's inexplicable connection to her. Could it be more than coincidence? "I'll look into it," Elias murmured, throat dry. Harris's tone softened. "I'll keep digging, but sounds like something's coming together." They ended the call, but Elias remained standing there, gripping the phone tightly, his mind racing. He turned to glance at Lila, sitting cross-legged on the floor, coloring intently, and he knew there was no going back to pretending this was just chance. Later that afternoon, Elias found himself pacing outside Whitman's diner, the weight of the information pressing heavy on his shoulders. He hadn't told Lila. Not yet. He wasn't sure how, but there was one person he needed to face. Pushing open the diner door, the familiar chime greeted him. Gus gave him a nod, but Elias barely registered it. Vivian was already there, seated in her usual corner booth, her posture straight but visibly distracted. She looked up as he approached, her expression softening slightly. "Elias," she greeted, setting down her coffee. "Everything all right?" He stood there a moment, uncertain of how to begin. "Could we talk?" She gestured for him to sit. "Of course." For a few seconds, the air between them was filled with the quiet hum of the diner, but beneath it, a tension simmered, something unspoken pressing to the surface. "I asked someone to look into Lila's records," Elias said. Finally, his voice low, steady. "I've always told myself it didn't matter where she came from, but lately, I think she deserves to know." Vivian's gaze sharpened, lips parting slightly. He hesitated, meeting her eyes. "Her birth mother's name was Hannah Alden." Time seemed to pause between them. Vivian's breath caught audibly. Her hand trembled as she reached for the coffee cup, but stopped short. Elias watched her carefully, noticing how her carefully composed mask began to fracture. "She was your daughter, wasn't she?" he asked gently. Vivian swallowed hard, nodding slowly, unable to speak for a moment. "I had Hannah when I was barely 18, she whispered, her voice cracking. "My parents, they made decisions for me. I wasn't strong enough to stop them." Tears shimmered at the corners of her eyes, though she blinked them back fiercely. "I never knew what happened to her," Vivian continued, her voice barely audible. "I spent years searching, but when the adoption records were sealed, I gave up hope." Elias's heart clenched. Suddenly, so much made sense. The way Vivian looked at Lila, the connection that seemed impossible but unmistakable. She died. "Young," Elias said quietly, "but not before bringing Lila into the world." Vivian's hand covered her mouth, her composure breaking entirely now. She had a child." Elias nodded, his voice low. "Your granddaughter." Vivian's shoulders shook as the weight of the revelation settled fully. She wiped at her eyes quickly, trying to gather herself. For a moment, neither spoke. It was Lila's soft voice that broke the silence. "Daddy." She called from the entrance, her sketchpad tucked under her arm. She'd followed him inside without him noticing. She looked between Elias and Vivian, sensing something shifted. Vivian inhaled shakily, wiping at her face once more before, kneeling slightly eye-level with Lila. "Hey there, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice gentle but thick with emotion. Lila studied her, tilting her head. "You okay?" Vivienne gave a small, watery laugh, nodding. "I think I am." Elias watched as Lila reached out, small fingers brushing Vivienne's hand. Without realizing, Vivienne took her hand tightly, holding it as if anchoring herself. And Elias knew, at that moment, that everything had changed. The truths they'd spent years avoiding had finally surfaced, raw and undeniable. Yet strangely, amidst the uncertainty, there was relief, a quiet recognition that, for the first time, none of them had to carry their burdens alone. As the afternoon light streamed softly through the diner windows, it felt like the storm that had hovered over all their lives had finally begun to lift. Elias Carter had never thought silence could be so deafening. He sat at the small kitchen table later that evening, elbows resting on the worn wood, staring at the cup of coffee cooling between his hands. The apartment was quiet, except for the soft sound of Lila in the next room, humming as she carefully arranged her crayons. He should have felt lighter, he told himself. Questions that had lingered in the background of his life for 6 years finally had answers. The puzzle pieces of Lila's past had fallen into place in the most unexpected way, and yet the weight pressing against his chest felt heavier than ever. Vivienne Alden, no, not just Vivienne. Lila's grandmother. That truth alone was enough to unsettle him. He thought of how she had looked in the diner earlier that day, shoulders trembling, eyes glistening with tears, as she reached for Lila's hand like it was the only solid thing. In the room, Elias had never seen her so raw, stripped of the poised exterior she carried like armor, and now, as much as he tried to make sense of how their lives had converged, the reality felt like standing at the edge of something vast and unfamiliar. What did this mean for them? For Lila, he rubbed his face with both hands, trying to untangle the threads spinning in his mind. That's when he felt a soft tug on his sleeve. He glanced down to see Lila standing beside him, clutching her sketchpad to her chest, her brows knitted. In quiet concern, "Daddy," she asked softly. "Is she sad?" It took Elias a moment to realize she meant Vivienne. He reached out, pulling her gently into his lap, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "She's figuring things out," he answered honestly, voice low. "Kind of like we are." Lila looked up at him, serious now, her little hands gripping her sketchpad tightly. "Can she come over?" she asked innocently. "I want to show her my drawings." Elias felt his heart catch. He smiled faintly, brushing a lock of hair from her face. "We'll see, sweetheart." But deep down, he knew Lila had already decided. The next day, Whitman's diner felt quieter than usual. Vivienne sat at her usual booth, staring out the window as people moved through the small town like clockwork, steady, predictable. Everything around her remained the same. And yet, she felt irrevocably changed. The revelation from the day before still echoed inside her, like an old song she'd forgotten but suddenly remembered every word to. Hannah, her daughter, gone. And yet, in the most improbable twist, there sat a living piece of Hannah in the world, a granddaughter she never imagined existed. Vivienne's fingers curled tightly around her coffee cup, the warmth grounding her, but doing little to still the flurry of emotions. She wasn't used to feeling this out of control. Every decision in her life had been calculated, deliberate, but none of this followed a plan. As if summoned by thought, the bell above the door jingled, and Elias entered, Lila bounding beside him. Vivienne straightened slightly, her heart leaping. Before she could stop it, Elias caught her gaze, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. He hesitated for only a moment before leading Lila straight to her booth. "Mind if we join you?" he asked quietly. Vivienne shook her head, unable to trust herself to speak. Lila slid in beside her without hesitation, already flipping open her sketchpad. "I made you something," she announced, her smile bright, unaware of the fragile weight hovering between the adults. Vivian glanced down at the drawing, 3 figures standing beneath a wide tree, hand in hand, 2 adults and 1 child. She swallowed hard, the lump in her throat almost impossible to dislodge. "It's us," Lila added matter-of-factly. "Me, Daddy, and you." Vivian blinked, willing herself not to cry. "That's beautiful," she managed softly, tracing a finger over the lines. Lila beamed, proud. Across the table, Elias sat quietly, watching them. His jaw was tight, his eyes contemplative. After a long pause, he spoke. "I don't know how to do this," Elias admitted, voice low, earnest. "I've spent 6 years raising Lila, protecting her. Her world has been small, simple." He exhaled, glancing at Vivian. "But I also know that family doesn't always come in the way you expect." Vivian met his gaze, something unspoken, a passing between them. "I don't want to take anything from her," she whispered, voice breaking slightly. "Or from you," Elias shook his head. "I know." Lila looked between them, sensing the shift, her smile dimming slightly. After a moment she reached out, placing one small hand over Vivian's and the other over Elias's. "Why don't we all be together?" she asked simply, as if it were the most obvious solution in the world. Both adults stared at her, caught off guard. Vivian let out a soft, almost disbelieving laugh. "Oh, sweetheart." But Lila's eyes were steady, filled with something pure and unwavering. Elias swallowed hard, his gaze lingering on Vivienne. Maybe Lila saw something they couldn't yet name, a way forward neither had dared consider. Vivienne gently squeezed Lila's hand, her other hand brushing against Elias's briefly, tentatively, and in that fragile, unexpected moment, something began to settle between them. Not quite a resolution, but a beginning. The walls they'd both built, brick by brick over the years, were slowly, quietly crumbling. Perhaps Lila had known the way all along. The sky over Millbrook gleamed a soft gold as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the town's quiet streets. Spring was arriving in whispers, buds unfurling, the air tinged with newness. It was the kind of day when everything felt poised for change. Elias Carter stood outside his modest apartment, keys in hand, watching as Lila skipped down the walkway ahead of him, her ponytail bouncing with each step. Clutched in her small hands was a folded piece of paper, a drawing she had insisted on finishing before they left. He glanced at the driveway, where Vivian's sleek black car waited. The woman herself, leaning casually against the passenger, sighed, arms folded, sunglasses shielding her eyes from the glare. It still felt strange, surreal even, how naturally she had begun appearing in their lives. Dinners shared, quiet afternoons spent at the park, Lila slipping her hand into Vivian's as though it had always belonged there, and Elias couldn't deny it anymore. Something about the guarded billionaire and his little family felt right. "Ready, kiddo?" Elias called, pocketing his keys. Lila gave a firm nod, rushing toward the car. Vivian straightened, removing her sunglasses as Lila ran up to her, handing her the paper with a grin. "It's us," Lila announced proudly. Vivian unfolded the drawing carefully. 3 figures once again, herself, Elias and Lila, standing in front of a house with tall trees, the sun shining overhead. This time there was something new. The words, "Our home," written neatly at the bottom. Vivian swallowed, her throat tightening unexpectedly. Elias approached, hands in his jacket pockets, catching the edge of the drawing over her shoulder. "She's got quite the vision," he said softly. Vivienne glanced at him, her smile faint but genuine. "She's a lot wiser than her years." Lila tugged at their hands. "Let's go." The destination was Vivian's lake house, a place she'd rarely visited herself, a secluded property tucked away just outside town. It had been sitting empty for years, gathering dust like so much else in her life she hadn't wanted to face. But today felt different. She led the way in silence as they drove out of town, Lila chattering in the back seat while Elias occasionally glanced at her. His eyes thoughtful but unreadable. The winding road gave way to a gravel drive, tall pines lining the edges. The house itself stood dignified, yet weathered. Stone facade, wide porch, windows gazing out over a shimmering lake beyond. Vivienne parked and stepped out, drawing in a long breath. She hadn't set foot here in over a decade. Not since before Hannah. Not since she'd carefully packed away every trace of the past. "Wow," Lila whispered, taking in the vast lawn and glimmering water. Elias helped her out of the car, eyes scanning the property with quiet appreciation. Vivienne lingered a moment, longer before turning to them. "I used to come here when I needed to feel small," she admitted softly, "when the city felt like it was swallowing me whole." Elias nodded, understanding. "Maybe it's time to feel small again," he offered gently. They moved through the house together, dust motes dancing in the shafts of sunlight streaming through tall windows, rooms filled with old furniture, faded, photographs, echoes of laughter long gone. Vivienne trailed her fingers over the piano in the sitting room, the keys untouched for years. Lila wandered freely, her steps light, her curiosity boundless. She peeked into each room, eventually finding herself at the back, where a glass door led out to a wide deck overlooking the lake. "Daddy!" she called, waving excitedly. "Come see!" Elias followed, stepping out onto the deck, taking in the view, the gentle lapping of water, birds flitting in the trees. Vivienne joined them, standing beside Elias, her hands gripping the wooden railing. "It's beautiful," Elias said quietly. She nodded, voice softer than usual. "I used to wonder if places could remember people. The things they've seen." Elias glanced at her, something warm flickering in his eyes. "Maybe they do." Lila leaned over the railing, gazing out at the water, then turned suddenly, face lit with an idea. "Can we stay here?" she asked, eyes hopeful. "All of us?" Vivienne froze, caught off guard. Well, Elias chuckled, shaking his head. "Sweetheart, Vivienne probably has other things to do." But Vivienne surprised herself. "No," she said softly. "I don't." Both Elias and Lila turned to her, surprised. Vivienne's gaze lingered on them, a man who had built his life, piece by piece, out of quiet sacrifice, and a little girl who saw the world with unshakable trust. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Vivienne felt still, and she realized she wanted to feel that way more often. "Maybe it's time to stop running," she added, her voice barely above a whisper. Lila beamed, slipping her small hand into Vivienne's. Elias watched them, his own chest tightening, something shifting inside him that felt frighteningly like hope. The three of them stood together on that deck, the lake stretching endlessly before them, the wind stirring softly around their feet. No promises were spoken, no declarations made, but something unspoken had settled between them, gentle, certain, a family rewritten. The soft bell above Whitman's diner door jingled as the late afternoon sunlight streamed through the wide front windows. Spring had settled fully into Millbrook, breathing life into every corner of the little town. The trees outside shimmered with new leaves, and the air carried the gentle scent of fresh blooms. Inside, the diner buzzed with its usual comforting rhythm. Familiar faces filled booths, Gus moved deftly behind the counter, and the jukebox hummed faintly in the background. But something about today felt different. At the booth by the window, Elias Carter sat with his daughter Lila, their usual spot, claimed like it always had been. Across from them, Vivienne Alden sat quietly, hands folded, her posture relaxed but reflective. It had been weeks since that afternoon at the lake house, yet the ripple effect of that day lingered. The walls between them had thinned, no longer sharp and fortified, but soft, worn down by small gestures, a shared dinner, a walk through town, an afternoon spent reading together. Their lives, once running parallel but separate, had begun to intertwine. Elias glanced at Vivian now, noting how her eyes followed Lila's every move, how her laughter came easier, how she looked less like the woman who'd walked into this diner weeks ago carrying invisible burdens. Lila giggled, waving at Gus as he brought over a plate of pancakes, extra syrup just the way she liked. Vivian reached across the table, gently tucking a stray strand of hair behind Lila's ear. The tenderness in her touch was unmistakable. "Big plans for today, sweet pea?" Elias asked, sipping his coffee. Lila nodded eagerly, her eyes bright. "I want to go to the park and maybe show Grandma Viv the new flowers." Vivian smiled, softly at the title, Grandma. It had slipped from Lila's lips naturally one afternoon, and though Vivian had frozen in surprise at first, she hadn't corrected her. "I'd love that," Vivian said, voice warm. They fell into a quiet rhythm after that, the comfort of ordinary moments holding them together in ways words rarely could. Gus appeared suddenly at their booth, a knowing grin creasing his weathered face. "You three look like a postcard," he teased, setting down refilled coffee mugs. Elias chuckled, shaking his head. "Guess we're starting to fit the part." Gus's eyes lingered on him for a beat longer, and his voice softened. "Sometimes the best families are the ones you never saw coming." Vivian looked down at her coffee, fingers curling around. The warm mug. She thought of all the years she had spent building a life defined by solitude, boardrooms, empty penthouses, gala nights that felt hollow. And now here in this unassuming diner, she felt something she hadn't felt in decades. Belonging. As if on cue, Lila slid from her seat, grabbing both Elias and Vivian's hands. "Come outside," she urged. "It's too pretty to stay inside." They laughed, following her out onto the quiet street. The afternoon sun painted everything in gold, the breeze soft and playful as Lila skipped ahead. Elias fell into step beside Vivian, their shoulders nearly brushing. He glanced sideways at her, his voice low but sincere. "You thinking about staying longer?" Vivian exhaled slowly, looking out at the town she had once viewed as nothing more than a quiet escape. "I used to believe my life was already written," she admitted, "set in stone, but lately I'm not so sure." Elias smiled faintly, his eyes warm. "Sometimes the best stories get rewritten." She looked at him, really looked at him, the lines on his face etched from years of responsibility, the steady way he watched over Lila, the quiet strength he carried. It wasn't the life she'd once imagined. It was better. Ahead of them, Lila stopped suddenly on the sidewalk, pointing to a patch of wildflowers growing along the fence line. "Look," she exclaimed. "They're all different colors, but they're together." Vivian crouched beside her, smoothing her hand over Lila's hair. "They're more beautiful that way," she said softly. Lila beamed, nodding enthusiastically before grabbing Vivian's hand again. Elias approached, resting a hand lightly on Vivian's shoulder. A simple gesture, but one filled with unspoken understanding. Together, they stood in the afternoon light, three lives that had once been marked by absence, now filled with quiet presence. As they turned back toward the diner, Vivian glanced over her shoulder, taking in the scene. The soft hum of the town, the people she once thought she'd never know, and the little girl who had, without realizing, stitched them all together. Her heart felt light, full, not because every question had been answered or every wound healed, but because she had finally stopped running. Elias caught her gaze, his smile easy, steady. They didn't need to say anything. Everything important had already been understood, and as the bell over Whitman's diner jingled behind them, the door swinging open once more, it felt like life itself had offered them all a second chance. Chance they hadn't dared hope for, a family rewritten. And sometimes it only takes one simple question, one unexpected moment, to rewrite the story of a lifetime. In the quiet corners of a small-town diner, a struggling father, a lonely billionaire, and a little girl with a heart full of hope found exactly what they had been missing all along: family, because kindness, love, and second chances often come when we least expect them, and they're always worth believing in. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe. And join us for more tales of hope, love, and the beautiful ways life surprises us. Until next time, keep believing in the magic of ordinary moments.